It's very humbling, an absolute privilege to be able to talk to your community. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Karissimas, as I said. I'm a doctor of human geography, and I've got two different areas of expertise. My PhD was actually a computational model for radiation protection. But since then, I felt very moved to write on the cultural and the social and environmental harms of nuclear weapons. And I've been very lucky, as John mentioned, to have just won the LHM Ling Outstanding First Book Prize for my first book, which I never thought I'd write. It's a whole other story, but we'll maybe talk about that another time. My aim today is to kind of share my understanding and knowledge of Karissimas with you. I think it's a really interesting position, like an interesting situation for it at the moment. And as I said, it's Karissimas. So in Kiribati, which I speak a little of, if you want to say hello in Kiribati, it's Maori. It's pronounced Karissimas. It's in the middle of the Pacific, and it's the largest coral atoll in the world, but at no more than 2 meters above sea level at its highest point. It's also one of the most climate vulnerable inhabitable islands in the planet. You know, it's at the center of the world, but you can't pinpoint it on a map. Most people can't, but now you will be able to. So it's stuck between this, bookended between these two hazards. It's had the impacts of nuclear weapons testing in the past, which I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the history of. And then it's got this future climate change threat. So I work on the intersection between these two risks and what we call existential threats. If you want to go and read a bit more about my climate change work, I recommend the BBC. If you want to read a bit more about my nuclear work, I recommend The Independent. Those are kind of the two areas that I work in. And it's a huge problem because there's these historic legacies that haven't been dealt with, and these future risks which are not being dealt with. There's this protection gap as well in law. So at the moment, there's not a recognised definition for the climate refugee, and climate change refugees are not protected under the UN 1951 Refugee Convention. So there's a protection gap. And obviously, we know that this climate change issue that's affecting Karissimas is arising due to the actions of the global north, due to industrialized nations. You know, the US and the UK, we've all paid our part when we had our industrial revolution. We didn't mean to, but we have. And so therefore, it's our duty, I would say, our moral and ethical duty, to combat and to think about how we can support and resolve communities like the amazing people of Karissimas, to be able to look forward to their future rather than have to worry about the effects of climate change, and to not be compensated and not be supported for the effects of global north nuclear weapon tests. So going back to the nuclear weapons though, in the 1950s, Karissimas, it was used by Operation Grapple. So that was a US joint services operation. So it included the Army, the RAF and the Air Force, to test Britain's first hydrogen bomb. Then it was used by the US. So there was the US-UK Mutual Defence Agreement that came about after we demonstrated we had hydrogen bombs. So it was used afterwards for Operation Dominic too. And it's not just Karissimas, the excellent James Bhagwan and John Cooper have said, this is a global issue. However, for Karissimas, I'd say, and the Pacific, it is a particularly pressing issue, the way that climate change and nuclear warfare intersect. So, as I was saying, if you want to go read a little bit more, there's a link here so you can see I work with a variety of different academics. I work with environmental scientists, I work with social scientists, to kind of learn a bit more about what to do and how to support this community. But of course, the key really to understanding, what to do is, as John rightly said, listening to the voices of the community and what they want. And they don't want their island to disappear. They don't want to be left behind. And when we think about development, they want opportunities for development. They want opportunities for growth, and they want opportunities to reclaim the lands in their island spaces. Those are kind of the three issues that I've spoken about with them. So how did it happen though? Just to give you a quick overview of history, that's kind of, you can go back to this. This is great actually that you're recording, because it will be a really nice resource, I think. But you can see that, as James Bhagwan mentioned earlier, there was Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Then from about 1952 to 1996, when we had the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, various countries were testing nuclear weapons in various different places. And we still have nuclear weapon tests undertaken by places like North Korea that are not part of that treaty. And we also have Donald Trump threatening to do nuclear weapon tests, which I'm not very impressed with at all, as you can imagine. But my area of expertise is thinking about how the Cold War links into what's happening now. Generally, kind of as far as fieldwork's concerned, these are the places I've undertaken fieldwork. The green is Hawaii, which, like John, due to COVID, I wasn't able to get out there and work myself. So I've got quite a legacy of knowledge, I'd say, in the area. So thinking about Karissimas, I want to introduce this concept. It's a really powerful and useful concept, I think, of nuclear imperialism. So we're all familiar with colonialism. We're all familiar with the impacts of empire, right? It's been in the news a lot recently. The idea of nuclear imperialism is very specific in that it's the use of spaces like Karissimas, like Bikini Atoll, even like Nevada, to test nuclear weapons where indigenous people live. So it's this idea that people go in and undertake these nuclear weapon tests in land that it does not belong to them, when we think about kind of the legacy and the birthright of that environment. So two key examples that I study and research myself are the people of Karissimas, but I also look at Aboriginal communities in Australia and how they've been impacted by the nuclear weapon tests. So I wanted to give you a few quotes really to kind of make you think about what it was like, what the experience was like for the veterans as well, because you've got islanders and veteran communities. And the reason why I mention this is I'm going to go back to it in a few minutes and give you a bit more of an insight, because I also got to witness the nuclear test veterans come back in an act of peaceful existential tourism to try and commune with the islanders and learn about their experiences and share their experiences and contest the injustices they've experienced 2 years ago. But this is just a quote. We were told to stand with our eyes back, with our backs to the detonation, and to put our fists into our eye sockets, to cover our eyes. The flash was so bright that I could see the bones in my hands, like an X-ray, 1,000,000 times brighter than the sun. My neck burnt from the heat and the wind. You couldn't imagine it. And so the conditions on the island were 20,000 British, Fijian, nuclear, New Zealander, Australian and American servicemen who worked on these Airbus nuclear weapon tests. Out of this, a third of British nuclear test veterans were conscripted. They had no choice. And when we think about communities in Fiji and in New Zealand, again, there were communities who did not have a choice beyond being conscripted, where there would have been martial law put against them if they didn't undertake this work. And one of the notable things is that at the time when it was considered, and when the nuclear weapon tests were talked about in the media of the time, they were described as these kind of desolate, uninhabited desert islands. And of course, now we know that they were not. There was an islander population who remained on Karissimas during these tests, and there are still people alive there now who can tell the tale, who can share the testimony and their experience of having their homelands essentially nuked. It's quite shocking. And nothing I'm telling you today is anything that I cannot substantiate with academic archives, with military archives, and with the materials that are available in the public domain. So if you want more information, I can send you my peer-reviewed academic papers, and I can also send you the files that go alongside. So for instance, AWRE archives. So one quote that I came across is from the AWRE Grapple Operational Report, which is in the Atomic Weapons Establishment archives. And this was the pre-planning before the hydrogen bombs were detonated on Karissimas. They said, the civilized populations assumed to wear boots and clothing and to wash. The amount of activity to produce this dosage is more than necessary to give an equivalent dosage to primitive peoples who are assumed not to possess those habits. It is assumed that in the possible regions of fallout at Grapple, there may be scantily clad people in boats to whom the criteria of primitive people should apply. This is so racist. This is so obviously racist. They didn't even classify the people of Christmas as people. They were primitive peoples, whatever that meant, which meant they had less rights, which meant their human rights were not protected. It meant that they were not protected. And it's a very similar situation in Australia, actually. One of the things that I find really striking is that if you go look at the Australian census, Aboriginal people, Aboriginal communities were not included as human until 1967. So this is a universal issue. And I know it's quite shocking, but I think that it's something that we should be aware of and we should talk about when we're thinking about how to make peace, because we have to reflect upon what has been done and how we can kind of, provide reparations and provide support, whether that is spiritual support, financial support, cultural support, and whatever is needed. And at the time, there was also limited and imbalanced interactions between military personnel and the islanders, and those who went to serve were told to stay away from the islanders. I often wonder if it's because if they realised they were human, they wouldn't have undertaken the tests. So this is just a quote from one of my interviews. We were told to stay away from the village, especially their children, their women, and they gave their children sweets. And we bought trinkets from the villagers for our families. So I have this very limited transactional interaction. And so when I was out there, I was very lucky. I spoke to some incredible women. And the majority of interviews I did were with women who lived through these nuclear weapon tests and lived to tell the tale. And, I spoke to women who had had miscarriages, who had had life challenges, who'd been made deaf by the blast, who had tinnitus for the rest of their lives from the effects of the, from the Grapple nuclear weapon test series. And we don't think about that. We don't think about these other effects, but they're very present and very real. One of the other things that I think was very profound is kind of the level of fear, the experience of being herded onto a boat and told to watch a Disney movie while your environment is being contaminated, essentially, while you can hear the blast going off, and being treated as less than human. This sensitive, intelligent, compassionate, amazing community. I tell you, any of you who visit, any of you who go spend time in Kiribati, and I would recommend it, the people there are astounding. They were generous to me. They let me into their homes. They took time to talk to me. They have a very sophisticated social structure, which is arguably more sensitive and more considered than ours in the UK, I would say, as they live in communities. And so the stories unfolded as I was talking to the communities. They would tell me things like, you get food poisoning even from drinking fresh coconut. All fish except shark gave us cramps. We were given some medicine from the soldiers. So their environment, their land, their food was polluted by the nuclear weapon tests. Here are two women. The one on the right is called Teawa, and I was actually chatting to her this morning about what I was going to do today. And she is a Christian herself. There's a very strong Christian culture which helps to support these communities and helps them stay together. And she said to me, she's the chairwoman of the Kiribati Cancer Survivors Association, right? They have to have an association for that. It's a small island, but they're fighting for recognition of what they've lived through and the harm that's been undertaken to their land and to their culture and their community. And she said, mention me, tell everybody about me. And so if any of you want to talk to her afterwards, I'm very happy to introduce you. So, but she was wonderful. She took the time to talk to me, and she said this. She said, I was young. I didn't know if it was good or bad. I wonder if the island elders were influenced to rise before the arrival of the British. Did they understand it would happen? Perhaps they understood but had no choice. They had no choice. I was able to tell her this. I was able to say, look, I've been through the archives. You didn't have a choice. This is not the responsibility of your elders. They did everything they could. But it was one of those situations of nuclear imperialism, of where, domination by the British, unfortunately, to our shame, I must say. And there was nothing you could have done. And all we can do now is to think forward about what you need, how we can get it out there, and how we can express the ways that things need to change for the future for you, and get you some comfort and get you some support for what you've had to go through. And so she said, perhaps they understood but had no choice. We were afraid and very innocent. We didn't understand how dangerous and bad for our environment the situation was. And I spoke to loads of people while I was out there, and everybody was so, very generous with their time. It was a very interesting situation to kind of be in anyway, because before I went, I'd always spoke to my nuclear test veterans, what do you think it's like for the community now, to try and understand their perspective and their understanding of the island, because many of them thought back fondly about kind of spending time there, apart from the nuclear weapon tests themselves. And so one of the veterans, Robert is what I would call him, because we use pseudonyms, wanted to go back, and he's in his early 80s now. And he said, I wonder what it's like there now. And so all these kind of different things came up, all these different things that come up in our conversations. Some veterans wanted to think about the environmental impacts. They felt a kinship that both veterans and islanders have been exposed in this way without a choice and without knowing, without being given the facts. So Christmas, 28th of April 2018, I was lucky enough to spend time out on the island for the 60th anniversary of Grapple Y, which was Britain's largest hydrogen bomb test. And this was a particularly important moment, I think, not just for these communities, but in history perhaps, as the nuclear test veterans, the men who had to test these bombs, these young soldiers who were only 17 and 18 when they sent on this trip across the world. And the islanders, the men of the islanders and the women of the island got together and talked about their experiences and shared this kinship and this understanding and tried to make peace with what had happened and tried to think, through making sure that it could never happen again. And I mention this because there are some nuclear test veterans who are quite staunch peace campaigners. I know one in particular who I'm friends with, who's a member of ICAN and who has spoken for ICAN. I know members who are in the CND. There's lots of different perspectives and different understandings. I just thought it was a really poignant moment. This is one of the ways the church comes in, because if you look to the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see a woman speaking. Now, this woman was one of the most amazing pastors and the most amazing preachers of peace I have ever heard in my life. So she attended a memorialization and reflection ceremony with islanders and veterans to commemorate both their experiences, to reflect upon the loss and the challenges that the islanders have faced, and to think about ways forward, think about ways that the nuclear test veterans can use their white male privilege, which they do have. I don't mean that in a harsh way, but they are in a privileged position to support communities who are less seen and less heard, but just as valid. And she was amazing. She went for it. She talked about the significance of peace, it's the importance of creating peace. And it was one of those moments that was just so evocative for me of what peace actually is, of how peace is about community, about bringing people together to think about how you can begin to change something that you are not happy with, and to create something newer, create something better, create something that is just and fair and good, right? And so she was phenomenal. And it was amazing, watching them get together and being able to kind of see them reflect and recall and consider the experiences that they had been through. And I found it amazing as well, because it made me think about forgiveness and the way that we forgive, or whether we choose to forgive or not. And personally, I thought, would I open my heart, would I feel comfortable supporting and engaging with a community of men who had bombed my island, right? And they were so generous. You could see them, they got together, they hugged the veterans and they said, look, we know this wasn't your fault. We know you had no choice. We're in this together. We have to stick together. And it was really one of the most meaningful things I've seen, I think. And this is just a photograph of some of the islander community kind of going through and looking at some of the photographs that the veterans have brought back for them. Your photographs of them playing football as young soldiers, or other little trinkets that they bought. So it was very powerful, and it really made me think about the way we forgive and the way we construct peace, not just as an academic, but as a human. So, because I do an awful lot of writing, but I also, you've got to think about how that and what you learn from your practice should apply to your life.
Mm.
So it's been such a pleasure to give you a quick chat. I've done also a big list of things, other things I've written, and this is just some of them. So if you ever want to have a look through, I've got lots more. Hopefully I'll send out the talk for you so you can kind of go through and have a look if you want to. Apart from that, it's been so nice to be able to, share my understanding and experiences with you. Shall I stop share now, John? Yeah.